You are listening to Radio SGN. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third episode of SGN Out Loud, a service of the Radio SGN Network. This is Madison Jones, managing editor of Seattle Gay News again. So glad to have y'all join us for another wonderful episode. Today, we're going to be talking about the investigative piece that I wrote for last month's issue about the Watoto Church sending its children's choir to fundraise at shows across Washington. We're going to be actually interviewing one of the sources that we talked to for this piece, Melanie Nathan. And yeah, without further ado, let's say hello to her.
Hey, Madison.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. Would you be able to give the folks a brief introduction of who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me thank you for engaging in the subject matter. I think it's really important. And I think that the subject matter of this piece that you did will really is able to expand and explain to people more about what is going on in general with LGBT people on the continent of Africa, which is a really important discussion at this time. So yes, I am Melanie Nathan and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director of the African Human Rights Coalition, and we work with LGBTQI plus people who are forcibly displaced by criminalization, societal taboos, in and from the African continent. We provide advocacy, we provide humanitarian services, we provide emergency services. There are literally thousands of people fleeing these criminalization laws, and this is something that I could speak about endlessly, so I'll leave it to you to ask whatever questions you might want to ask. That said, I started off, you might notice somewhat of an accent. I've been living in America for over 40 years, but I was in my 20s a human rights lawyer in South Africa, and then immigrated to the US way back when. And our work for African Human Rights Coalition occurs mostly on the African continent, where over 30 countries criminalize LGBT people out of the 54 countries. And here I am in America also with an office in Kenya and doing this work.
Great. Well, yeah, we're so grateful to have such a person with a strong background and professional knowledge of what's been going on the continent with LGBT folks. And that's very much why we reached out to you about this situation with Watoto in Uganda. And so I guess for this first question I have for you about Watoto, you've written extensively about the history and the individuals who've been a part of the organization over the years, including the founder, Gary Skinner. What would you like folks to know about Gary and his work with Watoto, the things that Watoto has done since its founding in the 80s up until today?
I think when we talk about Gary Skinner, we need to know that there's more than one Gary Skinner. That Gary Skinner represents the American evangelical that has gone to countries such as Uganda and preached the Kill the Gays bill. And so back in 2014, and I think that's when I first started writing about him, and that's when Watoto Church choir first came to Washington State. It was around then. It was then that it was actually quite a long time before that the American evangelicals went into countries like Uganda, but really focused a lot on Uganda, and saw it as fertile soil. As we were getting more equality in the United States of America and the so-called West, Africa became the place for the evangelicals to go. and preach legislation. Now, it was so fortuitous because it really brings us to Project 2025 and where we are now. That it's almost like they had the foresight. Let's lay the foundation work here. Let's build this kind of language, because one day we'll have the opportunity to bring this back to America, which is exactly what is happening with Project 2025. And Skinner and the organizations that he's involved with and other evangelicals are directly connected to Project 2025, which wants to take away our rights. That's why it's so important to be discussing this, of what's going on in on the African continent. So back in 2014, when we first started to write about the church, we pointed out that this idea that you look like you're doing something fabulous for a very needy group of people. So yeah, you build an orphanage, you build a library, you build a school, you build a hospital, and you're a great guy. But that gives you the opportunity to start a platform to preach your hate. And this is what they did. And they built it to the point where they were able to get the Ugandan parliamentarians interested in what was known as the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2014. And it colloquially became known as the Kill the Gays Bill, because it had the death penalty attached to it. And it passed back then. But what happened was the activists took it to court because there was not a quorum in the parliament at the time. And so the law was invalidated. 10 years later, 2024, with the same evangelicals doing the same stuff all those years, and quite frankly, my belief, not fighting back enough, with the complexity of not wanting to be perceived as that sort of post-colonialist that is telling an African country what to do. It so happens that this Kill the Gays bill got passed last year. So, I think Skinner has recently retired. I don't know if it was 23 or 24. You might know that, Madison, when he retired.
It was February of 2024, and in fact, it was only, I believe, a month or two before the law got passed in Uganda. So, yeah, it's very interesting that, right at that point, he supposedly steps back from the organization, though in the tax documents that we have from 2022 to 2024, he's still one of the directors on, at least for the American tax records, which they are still getting anywhere between $5 to $7 million in donations and contributions on their tax forms. So this is huge. I don't want to say business because they are a nonprofit, but they are making lots and lots of money off of, putting themselves out there as this organization that's saving Africans from particularly HIV/AIDS. A lot of their one on the tax documents, they say under their program that the services the money goes towards is for HIV/AIDS medical treatment and other services. But also just on their promotional materials on their website and everything. And even in the documentary video on the website with Gary Skinner, he talks about how, he goes to Kampala in the 80s and, seeing how ravaged people are from HIV/AIDS, that God speaks to him to save them. But ultimately, I wanted to ask you, can an organization ultimately be for the saving and treatment of people affected by HIV/AIDS while simultaneously supporting legislation that jails and calls for the death penalty of LGBT people? Is that ultimately, are they serving that point? Yeah.
Well, it's one hell of an oxymoron. I mean, it kind of cancels each other out. Let me give a few pointers to that. First of all, the World AIDS, HIV, the people that deal with it and fight it, and all the big annual conferences and all that, set a goal that by 2034, AIDS, HIV would be eradicated. If you're preaching anti-homosexuality legislation, you're driving people underground when that legislation comes to be, and even when it doesn't come to be. And preaching it in Uganda has spread across Africa because other countries are now doing exactly what Uganda is doing. So this Gary Skinner effect has multiplied. It's happening in Ghana, it's happening in Kenya. Burkina Faso never had criminalization just before, and this year criminalized LGBT people. And Museveni, the president of Uganda, said, I'm calling on all African leaders to save the world from homosexuality. He did this when he signed the bill last year. So what you have right now is this counteraction to HIV prevention and to eradicating HIV, because not that LGBT people are the only people obviously impacted by HIV, but if you think about it, if let's say there's 1 billion people in Africa, if 3% are LGBT and are a key population, that's like 50 million people right there. So driving people underground is not helpful. That's number one. People like Skinner and the evangelicals, we know that this is part of the Trump team. What has Trump done? He has withdrawn USAID. And I'm personally working with populations in different countries, in about 20 different countries right now, where safe shelter grants have been withdrawn, where HIV clinic grants have been withdrawn. And this is not conducive to eradicating HIV/AIDS. And America, which once played a part, thanks to George W. Bush, who was a Republican, who basically saved millions of lives, it's reversing now, thanks to Trump. So, and these are the people who are propped up, the evangelicals prop up. It's part of that same, group of people. So when you say that you're helping something on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you're doing something that destructive, what's that about? I think it's exploitation.
That's something I wanted to actually get into as a part of this interview, something I didn't get to ask you about when I initially interviewed you for this piece, which is we reached out to all of the host churches across the state of Washington to ask them about, just out of just making sure that the children and chaperones as a part of this process were going to be safe. Because in their planning packet that they had online, all of the children and chaperones were supposed to stay with host families from these host churches. And it was not clear at all whether they were taking the proper safety precautions to make sure that their child performers and chaperones were staying in safe environments. So we were able to get one of the host churches and venues to speak with us. The first stop, actually, which would have been 4 days ago on the 11th, Oak Harbor Lutheran Church was hosting a Watoto event at Oak Harbor High School. And we spoke to someone at the church who gave us this whole history of actually working with them all the way back, a decade ago, and actually sending members of their church to Uganda to work in their clinics and things. And, as a journalist, I simply wanted to know kind of the story of how these host churches end up working with Watoto and what their feelings on all of this were. And at the end of the interview, I asked the person who I'm keeping anonymous whether the church or they were aware of these allegations of, what would you say if you knew about that? And they were very defensive, and they accused me of making it political, which I found very unfortunate, because ultimately, this church is gaining so much donation money from these churches, millions of dollars. It's very concerning to, I would think that an organization like a church would want to know that their money is going to good altruistic places instead of, being used to support, anti-human rights legislation. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about that specific situation with the church and just these host churches in general in America and Western countries.
It's interesting. I want to come back to this point because it's super relevant to what you just said. There was a recent researched investigative piece, and I wish I could remember where to quote it from. I could always send it to you, but I think it was some Christian magazine that reported it. But in a certain time frame, over, I don't know exactly how many years, maybe the last, I don't know how many years, but they came up with a number. $50 million, 50, has been spent by the evangelicals to go to Africa to preach the anti-gay legislation. That's a lot of money. And now you're giving an example of how this money is raised. So, while these kids are singing for their bread and butter, they're also singing for this. So they, in my opinion, are being exploited for the purposes of weaponizing hate, delivered through religion. So there's that. As far as these hosts are concerned, you would think that if they had that much money coming in, I don't understand why they don't, if they're arriving in a town, why they don't rent, a Best Western or some decent hotel and bring a few chaperones and arrange the meals and, instead of spreading the kids around with people who've not been vetted, I would ask, have you fingerprinted people and done an FBI or whatever they call it check to make sure that you hosting these people with safe people? I mean, a lot of people go to church. It doesn't guarantee, and we know what some church scenarios have caused in our history. So the whole thing doesn't feel right to me. And I think I might have missed your actual question, if you don't mind repeating it, Madison.
Well, I just also wanted to clarify for the church that we interviewed, Oak Harbor Lutheran Church. They did say that they had a whole vetting process internally where they actually had the host families come and do trainings. They had a whole committee. So thankfully, talking to them, they did have a system, and that kind of gave me some relief to know that but I think you make a great point, which is that we've seen these tax documents, we see the amount of money that they're fundraising. And yeah, it really raises questions about why aren't they having the performers, the chaperones stay in the hotels as well. The packet does ask the team leader and the bus drivers to have hotel rooms. That the host churches should arrange that for the driver, for those three individuals. But yeah, and then I also wanted to ask kind of a bit of a tangent as I'm thinking about the packet. There was a couple stipulations about how to treat and receive your Watoto guests. One of them mentioned the use of technology, mentioning that telephones, internet, and other communication services should not be given to both the children and the adult chaperones, which was very surprising. I could maybe potentially understand, with children, being like, don't let children, get on a smartphone without adults around. That makes sense. But it also said the adults as well, and that really made raise some eyebrows for me as far as what exactly is this organization? Can it be trusted to treat its performers and chaperones ethically? It really should be something that I would encourage any host church interested in Watoto to really question. From your standpoint, your opinion, would you advise any host church to engage with Watoto? Should they outright boycott this?
So I think that it's an important discussion. And I'll tell you why I think they do this, and that can relate to the discussion. And it kind of reminds me in when did it happen? 2014-ish, 15, I hosted a Ugandan parliamentarian in San Francisco. I brought her from Uganda to the Castro. And she was one, so there was almost 100% of the Ugandan parliamentarians who voted for the Kill the Gays bill. And she was the one who was on the fence and didn't show up the day of the vote. And it seemed like she was against the bill, but terrified literally for her life that she was against the bill. And I said to her, would you be willing to say why and explain to people, you know, what it's like to be a parliamentarian and a woman who it goes against 98% of your fellow parliamentarians in a country like Uganda. Now I'm going to come back to that, because hold that thought. When you are living in a place like Uganda, there's certain things that I know that they put some kind of restrictions, and they have to do a special way of getting, for example, into social media and online, because so much is restricted and banned from what you can see and will never appear on Ugandan TV. It's a very oppressed society where the president has been despotically and autocratically president for over 40 years, to the point of even changing the law that when he aged out, they no longer had aging out. When he had come to his term limits, there were no longer term limits. So he has stayed in power all this time. And the way you do that is you suppress freedom of speech, and you don't allow people to see certain things. I was born and raised in apartheid South Africa. We never had television till I was 23 years of age, because the South African apartheid government didn't want people to see international stuff. They didn't want people to get educated. It was a way of keeping people dumbed down. And so you are less likely to rise up. And so when they did finally introduce, and it was before the end of apartheid, when they did finally introduce television into South Africa, was very restricted. We had, I think, 2 hours of TV a day, and there was 1 hour of government news, and that was it. So I see this thing of not even the adults can look at stuff as a continuation of the oppression. Now, look, Ugandans are free to travel, and you know, they can go out the country and look at TV anytime they like, and certainly there are things that they can do to. It's not North Korea, but it limits it, and limiting stuff has an impact. So I think that is what's happening, and I think that it is a way of keeping people suppressed. Now let's come back to the parliamentarian who came as what I saw at the time as a cultural exchange. You would think that bringing Watoto adults to Washington State would be a wonderful way to immerse and to have a way of learning more, which is what my intention was for that parliamentarian. Well, it's almost like in this case, they don't want people to learn more. In the case of my parliamentarian, I took her to a lesbian wedding at San Francisco City Hall. I took her to the Castro and had her look at men holding hands walking down the street. And the thing she said to me afterwards, which actually opened my eyes to a lot of stuff, was, and led to a really good conversation, was, Melanie, I didn't realize that this anti-homosexuality thing was, this homosexuality thing was more than just a sex act. Like, these people are actually in love. These people are actually couples. And that seems so basic to us, but the way being against homosexuality is sold in those preachings and churches is never about the love, and never about the coupling, and never about growing old and sitting on a balcony drinking coffee when you're 95 together. It's only about the sex act. And so I do think that having cultural exchange could be a really valuable thing. But I don't think the Ugandans are here to do that. They are here to raise money.
This episode is sponsored by Seattle Gay News. If you didn't know, we're the third oldest queer newspaper in the country, having provided the latest ongoings in our local community for over 50 years. We've gone through a lot of turmoil in the past, covering the AIDS crisis, the recession of '08, among many other challenges. But right now, however, we're going through an unprecedented period where companies that previously advertised with us have withdrawn their support in their finances. We're under more stress to keep the lights on than we've ever been before, which is a shame as this is coinciding with a new wave of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer leaders coming into our newsroom and creating great work with us. We want to be a bridge for the next generation of queer journalists. And with your support, we can achieve that mission and reach our fullest potential, creating more stories, art, and culture for King County locals in the process. We'd love for you to donate if you can. But even if you don't have much to give, simply checking on our website every week and reading the work of our incredible journalists, that'll help us sustain the next 2, 5, 10 years of our future. Simply go to www.sgn.org. Once again, that's www.sgn.org to read the best from a local queer institution.
All right. So for my next question, I actually wanted to ask about something a little bit different. We had an anonymous source reach out to us while we were writing this piece. This individual who lives in America now had family connections back in Uganda and had done their own research around Watoto due to some land disputes that this individual's family was having with the Watoto Church in Uganda. And yeah, this source ended up collecting a bunch of information, including a very unfortunate situation of a man who had his kidney allegedly taken by the church in India. I believe this man's name. I want to make sure I'm saying his name exactly right. There it is, John Joga Katamba. So this individual, this man, initially gone and agreed to go to India to do this kidney transplant because he had a relative, I believe a cousin, who needed it. And they were all members of the Watoto Church. But unfortunately, in that process of going to India to seek that medical care, this family member of his passed away. And he alleges that Watoto still took the kidney and gave it to another member without his consent, and ended up having a whole lawsuit about it in Uganda. Our anonymous source gave us information, including the legal documents, had interviewed Katamba about the situation. And so I wanted to bring that up to you, Melanie, because I wanted to see your thoughts and opinion on the other things that Watoto does in Uganda that folks who donate money to them might want to know about.
Yeah. You know, that worried me. I knew about that. And at first, when the story came to me, probably from the same source, and I did write about it at the time. At first, I was skeptical, and I thought, this sounds like something out of some kind of crazy book, or some fiction. And I looked into it, and it just got more and more real. And then I looked at the backing documents, and then when the lawsuit started happening, and then the nature of how that was settled, and suddenly it got quiet, it all just seemed really odd to me. But what I would say to the people that sort of donate in anywhere in blind faith, to do a couple of things. First of all, to always go to, for example, GuideStar, online and look at who you are donating money to and who you're supporting, who leads it, and just dig a little bit deeper. That's the first thing. Like when we give our money, we tend to do it quite in blind faith. And I would suggest, especially in times like this where we're not getting the truth all the time, or should I say minimally, that one should always do one's own homework. Then also remember that when you're dealing with a country like Uganda and with, a situation where there are orphans and vulnerable people and key populations and stuff like that, one has to know also that there's a lot of exploitation, there's corruption, there's dishonesty, and there is a lot of people that could succumb to that because they're struggling. And so how much of that does one want to support? I don't trust the whole Skinner network, and I don't trust the Watoto network at all because of these kind of dealings and even involvement, because I do think that that person was exploited and money was made around it. And so this is something that people have to be careful of. And I know that there's a sort of this inner conflict. Hey, but I want to support the orphans, and I want to make sure that they have their orphanage and that they have their food, etc., etc. Well, yes, but at the same time, people can demand transparency, and people can demand, and it starts with transparency. When you get real transparency is when you can start to see if things are going haywire or not. So I'm not of the ilk to say just blandly stop supporting something. I'm saying look further. But the very difficult thing for us as an LGBT community, especially from my perspective, where every single day my email box, everything that I look at is fraught with the most horrific stories of violence and persecution and forced flight with nowhere to go, no pathways, the suffering of LGBT people on that continent because of people like Skinner. So I'm very conflicted when you're throwing this, look at this wonderful orphanage versus what some of that money's actually doing. So there's no real answer from me except open your eyes and look at what's really going on.
Which, to really drive that point home, as we've been having this conversation, I realized we haven't really gotten into the weeds a little bit about how exactly Watoto and Skinner are implicated in these laws. In the piece that I had written, I really talk a lot about a particular individual, Stephen Longa, who is both elder of the church, who's been a part of it for over a decade, as well as having his own organization, the Family Life Network. And he has a very extensive history of supporting the anti-homosexuality laws, both in 2014 and 2024. He was part of these lawsuits when these laws were put into place and organizations were challenging the laws. Stephen Longa and his organization were on the other end in support with the government to make sure that the law would stay. I was going to ask both your knowledge or understanding of Stephen Longa's role in this, but also there's other individuals who are part of Watoto who are implicated in this that I did not have the time to touch on in the piece. Would you also be able to talk to us about some of those other individuals who've been part of this unfortunate process?
Yeah, it's been many years since I've looked at the exact people, their names, and researched them, which I did way back then. And I didn't prepare to come on here with, the exact names and what they've been doing since. But I will say this, that Langa, it was very instrumental in spreading the idea that gays should get the death penalty, and very instrumental in preaching it and using the rhetoric that not only brought about the bill, but also brought a climate of extreme danger for LGBT people for a very, very long time, a very hostile climate where over 90% of the population thinks that LGBT people shouldn't live. Imagine living in a place where over 90% of the people around you, your neighbors, don't think that you should exist. Right now we're dealing with what, a percentage, and in America, especially trans people right now, more probably than the larger LGBT community, are really dealing with people who don't think that they should exist, and it's a hell of a way to exist. But quadruple that in a place like Uganda back at that time, and still going on now. And the people who were involved in Watoto were part of this. And it's not just them, it's others. But the American evangelicals that went down there, and I'll name a few names: Lou Engle, Rick Warren, Scott Lively. Scott Lively ran for governor in Massachusetts some year back. Scott Lively got sued by Ugandan activists on American soil under something known as the Alien Tort Act for the harm and damage he caused in Uganda itself. So it's endemic. It's not just fringe. It's a real thing that's been happening. And there's a really good report recently by David McKenzie from CNN. I think it can be Googled. And I think my names might be on that report. If somebody wants to Google it, but I know African Human Rights Coalition was mentioned because they interviewed people at one of our safe houses in Kenya. And he talks about the current evangelicals who were literally in Uganda at the time of the passage of the current Kill the Gays bill. So this has a very, very wide net. I mean, if people are interested in this, there's an old movie which is still worth seeing if it's out there, documentary, called God Loves Uganda, and it really gives a sense of what people like Stephen Lunga were saying and doing. And so yeah, it hasn't stopped, and it's come back to us here. It's happening here right now as we speak. They want to reverse what we've accomplished as an LGBTQI plus community. They're still pumping money into it. And they are using these kids to raise the money to do it. So it hasn't stopped. And these people who are saying these things about LGBT people, they're using language and terminology that you will find familiar to us here, such as grooming, such as promoting, such as recruiting children into homosexuality. It's a lot of myth. But if you don't mind, I really want to take the opportunity to speak for 2 minutes to the harms that it causes our community. Is that okay with you?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm a country conditions expert witness in the US and global courts for LGBT people seeking asylum in America. And I write a report for each country when I'm representing an asylum seeker. And those reports are like 70 pages long about, I'm trying to educate the judges and the government of the United States as to why they shouldn't send that person back to Uganda or Ghana or Senegal or wherever. And I have in it a list of harms, and I explain those harms. And these harms that people suffer is not just the odd beating, as bad as that is, or the persecution or whatever. It's very deep, and it goes to, and I'm going to list them. These are the harms, and the reason I want to do that is this is what people are suffering right now in a way where they have no one to turn to. They cannot go to their own government. They cannot go to their own police, because if they do, it's like a bank robber going to the police and saying, hello, I'm a bank robber, help me. I just got hit across the face because I'm a bank robber, because they are perceived as criminals in their country. So there's no recourse. Here, as bad as when bad things happen, there's somewhat recourse. the human rights organization or the NGO or even the police. There is nothing. So here are the harms: the violence part of it, the assaults, the torture, forced anal exams after you get arbitrarily detained and after you're unlawfully detained for lengthy periods of time. In Uganda, there was a group of 6 peer educators, young men in their 20s, who were detained by the Ugandan government and accused of being a sex ring because they found rainbow flags in their offices. And these young men spent months in jail without bail, and they had forced anal exams, which the UN describes as a form of torture. There's that. For lesbians, there's so-called corrective rape, which even families get involved in organizing because they genuinely believe that it will help people straighten up. Then there's conversion therapies. In those conversion therapies, we're looking at starvation, and we're looking at a myriad of other things that are tantamount to torture. We're looking at what is called mob justice or vigilante justice, when you get attacked by massive groups of people. And there's all that physical stuff. And then there's things like banishment. Getting banished from your village, your home, your community is a social death, because in the African context, there's nowhere to go after that. So there is no safe place in most of these countries, because if somebody's single and they're not in the family unit and they're roaming around and it's a country with insurgencies, they're perceived as a stranger and they don't have anywhere to settle down. Right now on my desk, I have a pile that I can barely get through of people that are going through this. And then in America, we used to have the American government as somewhat of a guardrail, where we could go to the State Department and do stuff with UNHCR. All that funding's been taken away. And so much of what we used to be able to do, we cannot do now, even to the point of being unable to house and safe shelter people. So what these guys, the Skinners and the Langers and the churches set in motion, is a catastrophe of major proportion as I am sitting here right now. UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that if you went from Uganda to Kenya to try and get resettled abroad, UNHCR has had to cut back its entire operation by over 30%. And this was an operation that was already stretched way beyond its capability. So the entire humanitarian world right now, which has a massive effect on LGBTQI plus people, is teetering on absolute collapse. And there are not a lot of people doing the kind of work I'm doing. And we have no support. No support.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that. Just the dire circumstances of the current political climate in America making your work so much harder to do for these folks. And it's just so horrible and disgusting to hear what LGBT folks abroad in places like Uganda have to go through on a daily basis. I can only imagine, and like you've been saying, we've been getting a taste of it recently with some of the things that have been going on, but even then, not nearly to the extent of what these folks have to go through on a daily basis, which really, I think, encapsulates why this story and situation is so important and dire, and why we need to speak to it and make sure that folks are aware that, like, this organization, has this facade of being, supporting children and doing these things, but it doesn't take much to peel back the layers and really see just how much harm that it has been doing to folks in their own community. So yeah, with that, I just had one final thing I wanted to ask, which is what can we do now moving forward? What's the call to action here, as far as what should we be doing to make sure that that folks in Uganda and other places have the support they need, that we're helping enact that change, but also what can we do with the Watoto situation as well?
Yeah. So I don't really know what we can do with the Watoto situation more than what you're doing, Madison, which is awesome. And that is drawing attention to it, because what you've done is you've platformed this discussion and you're giving an opportunity to talk about the bigger picture and where it's led. You know, the thing people can do is, when you are looking at social media or you're seeing certain organizations such as mine reaching out for funding, we're not joking when we say we need the funding. You know, I don't draw a salary doing this work. I self-fund the operations of African Human Rights Coalition. But any money we get in will feed a gay person, an LGBT person, will house an LGBT person, or will pay for the medical expenses that we've had to do surreptitiously because they've been beaten up, or might pay for transport, or might pay for a passport, any of that. And if you're okay, I'll give our website for people to yeah. So our website is AfricanHRC.org. African HRC, so it's with an N on the end, AfricanHRC.org. And if you go to the donate page, we do take donations, and your donation will go directly to this kind of programming that we're doing. The way I survive is I do get paid by immigration clinics to do my country conditions reporting, which, by the way, now is like the government stopped that funding. So not only is the government picking up people off the streets where they need people like me to go into court for them, the funding to help people is gone. So, you know, I could go on for hours about the mess we're in. But anyway, and, you know, there's a wonderful organization called HIAS, HIAS. They do wonderful work. I don't see organizations, although they're very important, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, they sort of do the legal cases and the reporting, but they're not hands-on humanitarian work the way we do. And that is what is really needed right now. You know, in Zambia, we have a big group of LGBT people right now in a refugee center, and they're being told to leave. I don't know where they're going to go. We have a big group of LGBT people in South Sudan, from Uganda and from Burundi and from and Rwanda and from DRC. And they're all there, and they've been told they have to leave, and there's a war coming there. There is no money to help these people, and there are no pathways anymore. So, you know, it's one of the worst humanitarian crises in all my years of doing this work that I have ever seen. We're at a point of, so yeah, helping spread the word, volunteer, donate, invite us onto shows and to speak. You know, I used to be vice president of San Francisco Pride, and Pride often invites me back and puts me on their stages, and I get to talk about this kind of stuff. In fact, at San Francisco Pride a few years ago, we invited the High Commissioner for Refugees, Dr. Filippo Grandi, and he came and he did this big presentation on the San Francisco Pride platform, which was just incredible. So, you know, and a lot of the Pride organizations are now having human rights summits. So all of this is very helpful, spreading the word, and of course money.
Yeah, and we'll of course put all of that information, your webpage and everything up on the screen for folks at home who are watching the video instead of just listening to the podcast, which we have a new YouTube channel that folks can go to watch the video. And yeah, I mean, thank you so much for all of the amazing work that you do for LGBT folks around the world. And yeah, it really goes to show that as these anti-LGBT movements are exported outside of the US and Western countries to Africa, LGBT organizations and folks need to step up their game and make sure that we're not only taking care of ourselves at home, but we're also helping to take care of our LGBT brothers and sisters and non-binary folks who are living in these conditions. So yes, thank you so much, Melanie. for all the work that you do.